They're right on top of Bertha's den.
Fall back to the ship!
They picked the Yukon in the dead of winter because their scans showed almost nobody there. No cities, no power grid to speak of outside a handful of small towns. Temperatures cold enough to freeze half their equipment on contact. It looked, by every measurement that mattered to them, like landing on an empty planet. What their scans did not show was what was sleeping 4 feet under the snow, 300 pounds of muscle and bad temper, and exactly how short a fuse it had when something started digging too close to its den. If you love watching an invasion go sideways in the worst possible weather, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me the coldest place you've ever been. Now let's get into it, because the Threll Ascendancy is about to learn that empty on a scanner and empty on the ground are two very different things. 300 light-years out, aboard a survey vessel built for Cold World operations, Fleet Commander Isa Kale studied the readout on her tactical display with the particular satisfaction of someone who had finally found an easy assignment after a long string of difficult ones. Population density, she said. Her scanning officer, a compact, heavily insulated soldier named Torv, checked the numbers twice before answering. Negligible, Commander. This region designation Yukon territory registers under 40,000 inhabitants across an area larger than most of our conquered systems combined. Settlement clusters are small and widely scattered. Infrastructure. Minimal outside 2 population centers. No standing military presence detected. Civilian firearms registered but sparse. Kale allowed herself a rare moment of something close to relaxation. The Ascendancy had spent the better part of a decade subjugating worlds with dense populations, hardened defense grids, and organized militaries that made every landing a calculated risk. This region looked like the opposite of all of that, a vast, frozen, nearly empty expanse that her intelligence officers had flagged as the single easiest foothold on the entire planet. Temperature, Kale asked, mostly out of routine. Currently -31 degrees at the primary landing coordinates, Commander. Expected to drop further after nightfall. Our equipment is rated for Cold World deployment. Yes, Commander. What none of Torv's scans had flagged, because nothing in the Ascendancy's threat catalog had ever required them to flag it, was the exact contents of the snowbank 1.5 kilometers from their intended landing site. A den, carved deep into a south-facing slope the autumn before, currently occupied by a 7-year-old grizzly sow named, by the one trapper who tagged her years back, Bertha, who had gone into her winter sleep in good health, with a full season's fat reserves. And absolutely no tolerance whatsoever for being disturbed before spring. Log the coordinates, Kale said. We land at dawn. Dawn in the Yukon in late January did not look like dawn anywhere else. The sky stayed a deep, bruised blue for hours before the sun finally cleared the ridgeline, and the cold settled into everything, metal, wood, breath, with a kind of patience that made a person move slow and think slower if they weren't careful. Outside a small settlement called Caribou Bend, a trapper named Walt Nakamura was checking his line early, same as he did most mornings, when the sky did something he'd never seen it do before. It didn't streak or burn. It came down low and controlled, a long dark shape settling into the trees on the far ridge with barely a sound, and Walt stood there in the cold for a long moment, breath fogging, trying to decide if he'd actually seen what he thought he'd seen. He radioed it in on the same channel he used to check in with the 2 other trappers working that stretch of bush, mostly out of habit more than any real expectation that it would matter. You seeing anything weird out past Bertha's slope? Walt asked. There was a pause, then his neighbor Denise Whitehorse came back, voice crackling through the cold air. Define weird. Something big just landed in the trees. Didn't burn, didn't crash, just landed, like it meant to. Another pause. I'll grab the truck, Denise said. Word moved slow out there, the way it always did in a territory where the nearest neighbor might be 40 minutes away by truck and the nearest real town considerably further than that. But it moved, the same patient, reliable way it had moved through hard winters for longer than anyone could remember. One radio call, one truck engine turning over in the cold, one person deciding it was worth checking on. The Ascendancy's first landing team emerged from the ship an hour after touchdown. 12 soldiers in heated combat armor rated for conditions considerably colder than what they'd actually landed in, moving in the disciplined formation of a species that had conquered cold worlds before and expected this one to go the same way. Commander Kale led the advance herself, confident that a scouting party this size was more than sufficient for a region her own intelligence had rated as functionally undefended. "Establish forward position," Kale ordered. "I want a secure perimeter before the second wave lands." Her soldiers fanned out through the trees, weapons ready, scanning for any sign of the organized resistance their training told them to expect, and their sensors continued to insist wasn't there. What their sensors did register, a kilometer and a half out in closing, was a heat signature large enough to make Torv stop walking entirely. "Commander," Torv said, "thermal is picking up a significant biological signature ahead. Large mass, low but steady heart rate, subsurface." "Subsurface?" "It appears to be beneath the snow, Commander, possibly a den structure of some kind." Kale considered this for exactly as long as it took to dismiss it. "Wildlife," she said. "Continue the advance." What Kale did not know, and what her scanners had no meaningful way of conveying to her, was that a grizzly bear in the deep sleep of midwinter hibernation runs a body temperature only slightly lower than normal, a slowed but far from dormant heartbeat, and a level of awareness that could snap from unconscious to fully alert in under a minute if something disturbed the den deeply enough. Bears did not hibernate the way smaller animals did. They dozed deeply and efficiently, but they were never as far from waking as people like to assume, and digging equipment vibrating through frozen ground 100 meters from a den entrance was exactly the kind of disturbance that closed that gap fast. The advance team's engineer, tasked with clearing a landing pad for the second wave, activated a ground-leveling tool a stone's throw from the slope Torv had flagged, and the low mechanical hum carried through the packed snow and frozen earth in a way that no amount of insulation or stealth plating could have prevented. 400 meters away, beneath 3 feet of snow and packed earth, Bertha opened her eyes. Walt Nakamura and Denise Whitehorse reached the ridge above Caribou Bend a little before 9, parking the truck at a respectful distance and studying the alien ship through a pair of binoculars that had, until that morning, mostly been used for spotting moose. "That's not ours," Denise said unnecessarily. "No," Walt agreed. Down below, the 12 soldiers had cleared a rough perimeter and were moving with the confident precision of a species that had done this before, weapons ready, scanning the tree line for a threat that wasn't announcing itself the way threats usually did. Walt watched them for a long moment, then lowered the binoculars. "They're awful close to Bertha's den," he said. Denise took the binoculars, adjusted the focus, and went quiet for a second. "You think that matters to them?" "I think it's about to," Walt said. He'd trapped that stretch of bush for 11 years, long enough to know Bertha's territory better than his own backyard, long enough to know she'd denned up in that exact slope 3 winters running because the drainage was good and the angle caught the least wind. He also knew, the way anyone who'd spent real time around Grizzly country knew, that there was a very short list of things you did not do near a hibernating bear's den in the dead of winter, and digging equipment running 100 meters off the entrance was near the top of that list. "Should we warn them?" Denise asked, only half joking. Walt considered the 12 armored figures below, weapons raised, moving like they owned the ground they were standing on. "I think," he said slowly, We let this play out a minute first. Fleet Commander Kale's second wave landed 40 minutes later, doubling the ground force to 24 soldiers and adding 2 heavier transport sleds loaded with equipment for a more permanent forward base. The engineering crew, satisfied with their initial clearing work, began driving support stakes into the frozen ground to anchor a semi-permanent shelter structure. Work that involved considerably more vibration, considerably more noise, and considerably less consideration for what might be sleeping nearby than the first pass had. Torv, monitoring the thermal readout, watched the large biological signature shift for the first time since landing. "Commander," he said, careful to keep his voice level, "the subsurface signature is moving." Kale glanced at the readout without much concern. "Define moving." "It has changed position within the den structure, Commander. Heart rate has increased." Kale looked at the display a moment longer, weighed it against a mission timeline that called for a secured forward base before nightfall, and made the decision that would, within the hour, become the single most studied tactical error in ascendancy Cold World doctrine. "Continue the work," she said. "It's an animal. It will move away from the noise." What Kale did not understand, what nothing in the Ascendancy's considerable catalog of conquered worlds had ever taught her, was that a grizzly bear roused from deep hibernation did not, as a rule, move away from a disturbance near its den. It investigated. And a bear investigating a disturbance near its den, in the dead of winter, hungry, disoriented, and running on a level of irritability that no diplomatic protocol in the galaxy had ever been designed to soothe, was not an animal that behaved like prey. The support stakes drove deeper, the vibration carried further, and 400 meters away, Bertha finished waking up. She came up out of the snow the way grizzlies do when something has genuinely offended them, not slow, not cautious, but all at once, in an explosion of packed snow and frozen dirt that sent the nearest soldier stumbling backward before he'd even registered what he was looking at. 300 pounds of grizzly bear, groggy, furious, and running on the specific kind of aggression reserved for anything that interrupts a hibernation 4 months early, does not read on a Threll Ascendancy threat scanner the way an armed combatant does. It reads, if anything, as worse. An unpredictable biological mass moving at a speed the sensors weren't calibrated to expect from something that size, closing distance across open snow faster than any soldier could reasonably react to. "Contact," someone shouted, which was, by every account later filed, the single most understated word used in the entire engagement. Bertha hit the nearest support stake structure first, mostly because it was closest and mostly because it was still vibrating, and the entire half-assembled shelter frame came apart under a swipe that the Ascendancy's own materials engineers would later describe, in a report nobody wanted to write, as structurally unanticipated. Soldiers scattered. Weapons fire cracked across the clearing, mostly hitting snow, trees, and in one case, an already collapsed support beam. Kale, watching from the command post at the edge of the clearing, stared at the chaos with the particular stillness of a commander whose morning had just gone catastrophically, irreversibly sideways. "Status," she said, voice tight. "Unclear, Commander," Torv reported, ducking as a stray shot went wide overhead. "The biological, the animal, it does not appear to be retreating." "It is one creature." "Yes, Commander." "Against 24 armed soldiers." Torv watched a soldier get bowled sideways into a snowbank by a single swipe that hadn't even connected fully, and chose his next words carefully. "The creature does not appear to be aware of that math, Commander." Up on the ridge, Walt Nakamura lowered his binoculars and let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "there she goes." Denise, watching the chaos unfold through her own pair, shook her head slowly. "They dug right by her den. What did they expect?" "I don't think they expected anything," Walt said. "I don't think they knew she was there at all." Below, the 24 soldiers had gone from a confident, organized advance to something considerably less coordinated, scattering across the clearing in every direction while Bertha, still groggy but furious, plowed through the equipment pile that had caused the whole disturbance in the first place with the single-minded focus of an animal that had been woken up 4 months early and intended to make her displeasure known to every single thing standing between her and going back to sleep. Walt keyed his radio. "Might want to let the others know," he said to Denise. "This valley's about to get a lot more interesting." By midday, Commander Cale had pulled her scattered forces back to a defensible line nearly half a kilometer from the original landing site, a retreat she was already dreading having to explain in her official report, mostly because the phrase, tactical repositioning due to hostile wildlife, was not one that existed anywhere in ascendancy military terminology. "Casualty report," she said. Torv, still visibly shaken, read from the log. "No fatalities, Commander. 6 soldiers require medical extraction. Structural losses total the forward shelter frame, 2 equipment sleds, and 1 communications relay. The animal, designation unknown, remains active in the area and does not appear to be withdrawing." Weapons fire had no effect. Effect was limited, Commander. The creature's fur and fat layer appear to have absorbed or deflected the majority of small arms impacts. It is, by all available data, extremely well insulated. Cale stared at the tactical display, at the scattered markers indicating her own force's retreat, at a single moving contact still prowling the wreckage of what had, that morning, been a secure forward position. "It's a bear," Torv added, checking a secondary data feed that had picked up local wildlife classification broadcasts from a nearby set. T. Lemont's Weather Station. Local designation Grizzly bear, apex predator, solitary, currently should be in seasonal dormancy. Should be. We appear to have interrupted that, Commander. Cale closed her eyes briefly, the particular gesture of a commander recalculating an entire operation around a variable that had never once appeared in any threat assessment she'd been trained on. "How long?" she asked. "Until it returns to dormancy on its own." "Unclear, Commander. Local data suggests a disturbed bear may remain active and aggressive for an extended period, particularly if it perceives an ongoing threat to its den. And we are, by any reasonable measure, an ongoing threat to its den." "Yes, Commander." What Cale did not yet know was that Bertha was not, by any stretch, the only problem the valley was about to present her with. Word had spread down from the ridge the way it always did in that country, one radio call leading to another, one truck engine leading to 3 more, and by early afternoon, a loose collection of trappers, guides, and local hunters had gathered at a safe distance along the ridge road, drawn less by any organized plan and more by the simple, practical instinct of people who lived in bear country and understood exactly what a disturbed grizzly in the middle of winter actually meant for anyone working that land. "She won't settle till she feels safe again," said an older guide named Frank Charlie, watching the distant chaos through a spotting scope. "And she won't feel safe with something still digging near her den." "So what do we do?" Denise asked. Frank considered the question the unhurried way people in that country tended to consider most things. "We don't do anything to her," he said. "She's not our problem to solve. She's their problem, and it's the one problem out here that doesn't care how many guns you brought." Walt, watching the alien's scattered retreat through his own binoculars, allowed himself something close to a smile. "I've got a feeling," he said, "that they're about to figure that out the hard way." Cale's second attempt to secure the site came at dusk, this time with a full company and orders to establish a perimeter wide enough to avoid whatever territory the animal considered its own. It was, on paper, a reasonable adjustment. It did not account for the fact that Bertha's territorial range, freshly disturbed and now defending both a violated den and an injured sense of grievance, was considerably larger than any perimeter Cale's engineers had calculated. The company advanced in a wide arc, weapons ready, moving with considerably more caution than the morning's confident sweep. For nearly 20 minutes it looked, from the command post, like the adjustment had worked. Then a scout team on the perimeter's northern edge stumbled, quite by accident, into a second den entrance, a winter shelter Bertha had used in previous years, and disoriented by the day's disturbance, had retreated to instinctively rather than her primary site. The result was, by Torv's careful and considerably more diplomatic phrasing in the after-action report, a second engagement with substantially similar tactical characteristics to the first. Cale, watching her second company scatter across the snow exactly the way her first had that morning, sat back in the command post and allowed herself a long, slow breath. "We are being defeated," she said, "by a single, unarmed, non-sapient animal." "It is a very large animal, Commander," Torv offered, which did not help. By full dark, with both companies pulled back to the ship, and a growing list of damaged equipment that no amount of careful phrasing was going to make look good in an official report, Cale made the decision that every commander in her position eventually had to make. "Options," she said. Torv consulted the tactical display, the local wildlife data, and what remained of the operation's original timeline, and gave the only honest answer available. "We could commit heavier weapons, Commander. Sufficient force could neutralize the animal." "At what cost?" "Considerable collateral damage to the surrounding terrain, Commander, and an unknown but likely significant local reaction. Our sensors indicate the settlement population, while sparse, has been observing our operations for most of the day." Cale thought of the 12 figures she'd noted gathering along the distant ridge that afternoon, unarmed, unhurried, simply watching, not with the fear her doctrine predicted, but with something closer to patient, unbothered curiosity, the way a person watches weather roll in that they've seen roll in 100 times before. "They are not panicking," Cale said slowly. "No, Commander. They know this animal. They know what it will do." "It would appear so, Commander." Cale sat with that for a long moment, the way a person sits with a fact they should have understood from the very beginning of the operation, and simply hadn't been looking. For her scans had measured population density, infrastructure, weapons signatures, every variable her training told her mattered, and had entirely failed to measure the one thing that had actually decided the day's outcome. A population that understood its own land well enough to know exactly what not to disturb, and precisely enough patience to let the consequences of disturbing it play out on their own. "Withdraw the remaining forces to the ship," Cale said. "We are not equipped for this terrain." The Ascendancy ship lifted off just before midnight, its running lights cutting a slow arc across a sky gone properly dark, and clear the way it only got in real cold, and climbed until it was nothing more than one more point of light among the ordinary stars. Down on the ridge, Walt Nakamura and Denise Whitehorse watched it go, breath fogging in the deep cold, saying very little because there wasn't much that needed saying. "She settled down yet?" Denise asked eventually. Walt checked the handheld thermal unit he'd borrowed from the wildlife office earlier that afternoon, more out of curiosity than any real plan to interfere. "Signature's steady," he said. "Looks like she's headed back down." "Good," Denise said. "She's earned the rest." Frank Charlie, standing a little further down the ridge, allowed himself the first real laugh of the day. "Spent a whole career telling tourists to give a Denning bear its space," he said. "Never once figured I'd get to say I told a spaceship the same thing." Bertha, for her part, remained entirely unaware that she had, in the span of a single disrupted afternoon, ended a planetary invasion. She returned to her den sometime after midnight, resettled into the packed snow and torn earth with the weary irritation of an animal who had been woken up for no good reason at all, and went back to sleep. She would emerge again in April, thinner than usual and with a story, had she been able to tell it, that no one in that valley would ever quite believe in full. Walt checked on the den a week later from a respectful distance and found nothing but settled snow, a faint depression where the fight had happened, and no further sign that anything unusual had occurred there at all. He filed a brief, deliberately understated report with the Territorial Wildlife Office describing a disturbance near a known den site, and left it at that, mostly because he suspected nobody at the office would believe the fuller version, and partly because he didn't feel much need to convince them. Somewhere in a Threll Ascendancy archive, a single planetary notation was logged and never revised. Population density minimal. Infrastructure minimal. Local wildlife presents extreme and unpredictable hazard, particularly during regional dormancy periods. Note: local population demonstrates advanced awareness of wildlife behavior sufficient to avoid all direct engagement with hazard in question. Recommend total avoidance of cold latitude regions pending further study. Commander Kale added one line of her own, one that wasn't required by any standard report format. "We measured everything we knew to measure," she wrote, "and the thing that actually defeated us was asleep the entire time we were deciding whether this world was worth taking." Months later, in a training hall considerably warmer than the Yukon in January, a young Ascendancy cadet studied the case file on the incident with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect. "Sir," the cadet said, "the file says our forces suffered no fatalities and yet withdrew entirely from the region." The instructor nodded, "Correct. Against one animal. Against one animal that was, by every account, more disruptive to the operation than an organized defense force half its size would have been," the instructor said. "Remember this case, cadet, because it will not be the last time you encounter a world where the greatest threat isn't the population at all. Sometimes it's simply what the population has learned, over a very long time, to leave alone." The cadet looked at the file image a moment longer, a rough den entrance in the snow, torn earth, and a single line of Fleet Commander Kale's own handwriting scrawled at the bottom of the report. Added, the record noted, well after the official version had already been filed. "Let sleeping things sleep. We did not and we paid for it." If you made it to the end of this one, drop a comment telling me if you've ever run into a bear in the wild and how it went. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want more stories like this, and share it with somebody who respects a good hibernation. See you in the next one.